Hello, my dear friend. Welcome to my channel on Sleepy History, the place where the past whispers you to sleep. Tonight, we're diving into the story of one of the greatest empires the world has ever known, the British Empire, and the man who became its roaring lion, Winston Churchill. But first, tell me, where are you listening from? And what time is it there? Is the moon out? Are the streets quiet? Before we begin, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe, so this cozy history stays with you forever. Now, turn off the lights. Lie down. Close your eyes. Let your mind relax. And let me take you back in time. It was a cold night, November 30th, 1874. The sky above Oxfordshire, England, was covered in winter clouds, and deep inside the great halls of Blenheim Palace, laughter echoed. Elegant music floated through the air as noble guests danced and drank, unaware that in a quiet upstairs room, a boy was about to be born. His name would be Winston Leonard Spencer Churchill. He arrived not in a hospital or small countryside home, but in one of the grandest palaces in all of Britain, the same palace gifted by Queen Anne to Winston's famous ancestor, the honest Duke of Marlborough, for defeating the French in 1704. But the boy who cried his first cry that night was not born into the happiness and love you might imagine. His mother, Jenny Jerome, was a stunning young woman from Brooklyn, New York. Fierce, beautiful, and modern, she brought American spirit into the old British aristocracy. She wasn't just fashionable, she was intelligent and socially powerful. Her father, Leonard Jerome, was a wealthy financier, often called the King of Wall Street. Winston's father, Lord Randolph Churchill, was one of England's brightest rising politicians, handsome, sharp-tongued, with an old noble bloodline and ambition burning in his chest. He was the second son of the 7th Duke of Marlborough, and he moved quickly through Parliament with wit and energy. But despite their powerful names, Randolph and Jenny were not warm parents. They were more in love with society and status than with each other, and far less interested in raising a child than most would expect. Some say Winston was born early. His parents had married just 7 months before his birth. Others whisper that he simply rushed into the world during the grand party, while his mother barely had time to reach the bedroom. Whatever the case, Winston came into life surrounded by royalty and chandeliers, and yet deeply alone. As an infant, he was looked after by nannies and servants more than by his parents. He would spend hours in the grand halls of Blenheim Palace, crawling beneath giant portraits and antique furniture, while his mother traveled to Paris, and his father buried himself in government papers. But not all love was absent. In the quiet shadows of Winston's early life was a woman named Elizabeth Everest, his beloved nanny. She was not noble, not wealthy, not famous. But to Winston, she was everything. He called her Womb. She was the one who wiped his tears, told him bedtime stories, and kissed him goodnight when no one else remembered to. Years later, Winston would write about her with deep affection. "She was my confidant, my best friend, my protector. I loved her dearly." It was from her arms that young Winston learned comfort, not from his elegant mother or powerful father, but from a simple, kind-hearted woman who saw the boy behind the name. As Winston grew, he showed signs of curiosity, but not discipline. He was not an easy child. He daydreamed. He stuttered. He was clumsy and stubborn, always asking questions, always wanting to explore. At age 7, his parents decided to send him away to St. George's School in Ascot, a strict, cold, and punishing boarding school. There, young Winston tasted loneliness like never before. He was bullied, beaten, caned for minor mistakes. The cold halls of the school were a world away from the warmth of his nanny's stories or the quiet beauty of Blenheim. In letter after letter, he begged his parents to bring him home, or at least write back. But they rarely answered. One letter he wrote simply said, "I do wish you would write me a letter very soon. I long for one so much." But the response never came. Later, he was moved to Brunswick School in Hove, and then finally to Harrow School, a well-known, prestigious academy where future leaders were shaped. Even at Harrow, Winston struggled. He hated Latin, failed in mathematics, and was always seen as behind the other boys. But there was one area in which he quietly began to shine: English composition. He loved words. A had a deep memory, and when he spoke aloud in class, his teachers noticed something. Though he stuttered sometimes, when he found rhythm in a sentence, his voice carried power. Still, he remained far from the top of his class. And his father was unimpressed. Lord Randolph rarely visited, and when he did, he brought criticism instead of comfort. In one heartbreaking letter, he told Winston, "You are a constant disappointment to me. You have wasted your opportunities and your intelligence. I see no future for you." Those words could have crushed a weaker boy. But in Winston, they planted something else: a desire to prove, to rise, to build a name not inherited, but earned. He didn't hate his father, he admired him deeply, but the absence of his father's pride would haunt Winston all his life. At Harrow, he began to read widely. Not just novels, but military history, political speeches, philosophy. He memorized long poems, sometimes entire pages, and began practicing how to deliver them. He watched how words could move people, how speeches could change history. His favorite ancestor, the honest Duke of Marlborough, became a sort of spiritual guide for him, a warrior and statesman, victorious in battle and politics. And slowly, Winston began to see himself in that image. As his school years ended, he made a decision: he would join the army. But not just to serve, to write. He would go where history was happening and report it. He would travel, fight, witness, and then bring those stories back to the British people. But before he could do any of that, he had to pass the entrance exam to Sandhurst, the Royal Military Academy. He failed, then failed again. On his third attempt, he finally passed, barely. It didn't matter, he was in. Winston was not yet a man of power. He was not yet a voice of history, not yet a prime minister, not yet a world leader. But he had made it through the cold boarding schools, through the silence of his parents, through the cane strikes and cold nights. And now, he was about to enter the world. The boy who once cried in his nanny's arms was about to become a soldier, a traveler, a writer, and, one day, the voice of a nation. But for now, as the lights dim and the fire dies down, you can rest. The journey is just beginning. Sleep well. Tomorrow, the Empire calls. The year was 1895, and Winston Churchill was just 20 years old. He wore the polished uniform of a young cavalry officer, freshly graduated from Sandhurst, the Royal Military Academy. Though he had barely scraped through the exams, he now held a place in the 4th Queen's Own Hussars, one of Britain's proudest cavalry regiments. But Winston wasn't content to simply march and drill in quiet garrisons. He craved action, and even more, he craved an audience. You see, Winston had already discovered something powerful. He could turn battle into books, war into words, and bullets into bestsellers. Before ever firing a shot in battle, he had begun writing newspaper articles, bold, dramatic, poetic reports that brought distant conflicts into London's breakfast tables. He knew the empire was vast, and he intended to ride across it, pen in hand. In late 1895, Winston made his first journey abroad, not as a soldier, but as a military observer during Spain's fight to hold on to Cuba. He was only 21. Most young men would travel to Paris, or perhaps take a summer holiday. But Winston? He headed straight into a guerrilla war, under a sweltering sun, dodging rebels in the jungle, and sipping fine Spanish wine in officers' tents. And in between, he wrote. His letters to the Daily Graphic painted vivid scenes of night raids, palm forests, Spanish uniforms stained in blood, and the smell of gunpowder under moonlight. The British public loved it. He had found his formula: Go where the bullets fly, write what no one else dares to, and sign it with style. Next came India, where Winston was officially stationed in Bangalore. The sun was hotter, the colors richer, and the mysteries of the East filled his imagination. But Winston didn't waste his time with only drills and ceremonies. He turned his room into a miniature university. He wrote home for books, piles of them. Plato, Gibbon, Darwin, Macaulay. He began reading 4 hours a day, writing notes, debating ideas, preparing not just for war, but for politics. Still, he thirsted for battle. When tribal revolts broke out in the northwest frontier, a wild, mountainous border near Afghanistan, Winston volunteered to go. And there, he got what he wanted. His first real taste of combat. He rode with British troops into the rocky passes, where Pashtun warriors ambushed from the cliffs. Bullets snapped past his head. Men beside him fell. And still, Winston stood, riding at night, riding by day, living 2 lives, soldier and storyteller. His reports were turned into a book. The story of the Malak and Field Force. It was sharp, exciting, intelligent. And it sold well. He was no longer just an officer. He was a published author, a rising name. But the world hadn't seen anything yet. In 1898, Winston requested to join Lord Kitchener in the Anglo-Egyptian campaign in Sudan, a brutal effort to reclaim territory from the Mahdist rebels, who had humiliated British forces a decade earlier. Kitchener didn't want him. He thought Winston was too loud, too hungry for fame. But Winston used connections and squeezed his way in. He arrived in Khartoum, ready for another war and another book. In the burning Sudanese desert, he witnessed the last great cavalry charge in British history at the Battle of Omdurman. Picture it. Hundreds of British horsemen charging into waves of Mahdist warriors. Gunfire, spears, dust clouds so thick the sun disappeared. And in the center of it all, Winston charging forward with pistol in hand. He later described it with fire in his words. It was like running across the stage of history, bullets like bees, men falling like dominoes, and the world spinning in every direction. He survived, barely. Many of his comrades did not. And when the battle ended, he wrote the story in detail, not just of British bravery, but of British cruelty. He criticized Kitchener for his treatment of the enemy dead. It was bold. It was dangerous. But it made people listen. His book, The River War, sealed his reputation as more than a soldier. He was a moral voice, even if few agreed with him. By now, Winston had learned a powerful truth. Wars make heroes, heroes make headlines, headlines make careers. And so, in 1899, he did something shocking. He left the army. At just 24 years old, he became a full-time war correspondent. He had tasted fame. Now, he wanted to feed it. So when Boer War broke out in South Africa, he sailed straight into it as a reporter for the Morning Post, earning what today would be more than 150, zero for a few months of writing. This is the moment that changed everything. Winston was traveling by armored train in Natal when it was ambushed by Boer fighters, expert marksmen who derailed the train and opened fire from the hills. In the chaos, British troops panicked. Winston, though unarmed and a civilian, ran through gunfire, helping soldiers push the engine back onto the tracks, directing orders, saving lives. But then, he was captured. The Boers took him prisoner. He was locked in the State Model School in Pretoria, turned into a prison camp. The world was watching. The British Empire's favorite young writer was behind enemy lines. But Winston wasn't about to sit quietly. One night, under darkness, he escaped. He climbed over a prison wall, jumped onto a passing coal train, and disappeared into the night. He had no map, no food, no weapon, only a small stash of chocolate and raw courage. For 3 days, he wandered across enemy territory, hiding in bushes, dodging patrols, drinking from muddy streams. At last, weak and exhausted, he found the home of a British coal mine manager who risked his life to hide him. The news hit London like a storm. Churchill escapes. Hero flees Boer captors. The Empire's golden boy returns. Winston returned home to cheering crowds. He had become more than a writer, more than a soldier, more than a name. He had Becco by 1900. He was just 26 years old, and yet his name was known across Britain. The boy once mocked in school, the young man once told by his father he'd be a failure, was now a national celebrity. And so, with fame behind him, he did what he had always planned. He ran for Parliament. This time, not with a sword or a gun, but with speeches that could shake the walls. He stood for the Oldham seat, and this time, the votes went his way. Winston Churchill, soldier, writer, adventurer, had now become a member of Parliament. The world would never be the same again. But that is a story for another night. For now, let the sound of gunfire fade. Let the dust of Sudan settle. Let the trains of South Africa disappear into dreams. And rest. Tomorrow, we enter the halls of power. The young warrior has taken his seat, and the Empire is listening. Me, a symbol. It was the year 1900. Winston Churchill was just 26 years old. No longer in uniform, he now wore crisp suits and carried a silver-tipped cane. He stood on stages, waving to crowds, speaking with thunder in his voice and lightning in his words. And when the ballots were counted in the English town of Oldham, Winston had won. He was now a member of Parliament, one of the youngest in Britain. But he wasn't like the others. He didn't bow politely or keep his voice soft. He challenged the old men. He provoked. He spoke his truth, even when no one wanted to hear it. In the great chamber of the House of Commons, Winston sat quietly at first, watching the giants of government debate taxes, war, colonies, and coal. But soon his hand would rise. And when he spoke, even the elder ministers turned to listen. He attacked corruption. He defended workers. And even though he had been born into wealth, he dared to say things the rich didn't like. Winston had joined as a conservative, the party of tradition and empire. But deep down, he was not so traditional. He believed in change. And by 1904, just 4 years after entering Parliament, he shocked everyone. He left the Conservative Party. Winston crossed the floor of the House of Commons, a rare and dramatic gesture. He joined the Liberal Party, the rivals of his old allies. Why? Because he believed they were on the side of the people, the poor, the hungry, the working class. It was a bold move. Many called him a traitor. But Winston didn't care. He once said, "Some men change party for principle. Others change principle for party. I stand with principle." And once again, his risk paid off. In the Liberal Party, Winston rose fast. By 1908, at just 33 years old, he was appointed to the cabinet, one of the youngest ever to hold such power. His first big job? President of the Board of Trade. That might sound boring, but it was not. Because this was the moment Winston began building the modern welfare state. He introduced unemployment insurance. He pushed for minimum wages. He helped limit child labor. Has supported labor unions. All for the sake of the common worker. And yet, many still doubted him. In 1910, Winston took a new post, Home Secretary. Now, he was in charge of law and order across Britain. It was a powerful job, and a dangerous one. When riots broke out in Wales, Winston sent troops. When anarchists took hostages in London, he appeared in person, coat flying in the wind, watching the shootout unfold. People cheered him as brave. Others said he was reckless. Then came one of the biggest battles of all, not on a battlefield, but in Parliament. Votes for women. The suffragette movement was growing fast. Women across Britain demanded the right to vote. They held protests, hunger strikes, and even threw rocks at Parliament's windows. Winston supported reform, but not full voting rights yet. This caused fury. His speeches were interrupted. Crowds booed him. Suffragettes chained themselves to his home. It was a time of deep division. And yet, Winston stood firm, calm, bold, and never silent. By 1911, Churchill received a new title, one of the most powerful in the empire. First Lord of the Admiralty, head of the Royal Navy. Now, he wasn't just debating laws. He was commanding fleets. And he knew war was coming. Across the sea, Germany was building ships. Tensions in Europe were rising. So Winston modernized the Navy. He introduced new warships, faster and stronger. He pushed for oil-powered engines, giving Britain a crucial edge. He visited docks, tested submarines, even flew in early planes himself, always hungry for progress. By the time World War I approached in 1914, the Royal Navy was stronger than ever. And Churchill stood ready. In August 1914, the world changed forever. Germany invaded Belgium. Britain declared war. And Churchill was at the center of the storm. He sent ships to protect trade routes. He coordinated naval attacks. He tried to crush German U-boats. And at first, the British public cheered him. But then came the disaster. Winston believed in bold moves. And one of his boldest ideas was this. Instead of fighting Germany only in Europe, why not open a second front in Turkey? The goal: take control of the Dardanelles Strait, defeat the Ottoman Empire, and help Russia from the south. It sounded smart. But in practice, it was a tragedy. In 1915, British and Allied forces landed at Gallipoli. The Turkish cliffs were steep. The beaches were deadly. The planning was poor. And day after day, soldiers died in the sand. The campaign failed. Thousands perished. And Winston Churchill, though not the only one responsible, was blamed. He was forced to resign from the Admiralty. The hero of the Navy was now a man disgraced. Churchill could have retired. He could have stayed silent. He could have escaped the storm. But instead, he returned to what he knew best: the battlefield. In 1916, he joined the British Army in France. Wearing a captain's uniform, he served in the trenches of the Western Front. Yes, the same man who had once led fleets and debated laws was now sleeping in mud, leading men through shell fire and watching friends die beside him. He fought. He wrote. He mourned. And when he returned home, he was changed. The boy who once chased glory now understood the full price of war. By 1917, Churchill slowly returned to politics wounded, humbled, but not broken. He served in new roles: Minister of Munitions, then Secretary of War. He helped rebuild the army, supply weapons, and plan for peace. And in 1918, as World War I ended, he stood with the leaders of victory. But the world was not the same. Britain was exhausted. The empire was shaking. And the public no longer trusted old heroes. In 1922, Winston lost his seat in Parliament. He was out of power, out of favor, and many thought his career was finished. But Winston knew one thing: every fall is only a chance to rise again. Tonight, we end here not in victory, not in glory, but in a moment of quiet reflection. Our hero has seen power and pain, triumph and failure. He has walked through fire and still breathes. But what comes next? The next chapter will bring us to his greatest battle yet. Not on the fields of Gallipoli, but in the skies over London. Sleep now, the storm is coming. It was 1922. Winston Churchill had lost everything again. He lost his seat in Parliament. He lost the confidence of his party. He even lost his health, undergoing a dangerous appendicitis surgery that nearly killed him. Once, he had stood at the center of Britain's power. Now, he stood outside. Alone. He moved with his family to a red brick country house in Kent called Chartwell. It was peaceful there. Rolling hills. A small lake. Gardens blooming with roses. There, he found time to think and write. He had always loved words. So while politicians debated in London, Churchill poured his soul into books. He wrote long histories of war, of his ancestors, and of the world. One by one, his volumes filled shelves. And though his voice was missing in Parliament, it echoed in print. Winston's books earned him both praise and money. Enough money to keep Chartwell afloat, barely. He also wrote articles for newspapers across the world, sometimes historical, sometimes political, sometimes fierce warnings about the future. But as the 1920s rolled into the 1930s, Winston became something of a mystery to the people. Some called him brilliant. Others called him dangerous. He had left the Conservative Party, joined the Liberals, and now was somewhere in between. He seemed too bold, too stubborn, too out of place. In 1924, Winston returned to politics. He was re-elected as a member of Parliament, this time as a constitutional conservative. Yes, he was back, but not quite at the top. Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin gave him the role of Chancellor of the Exchequer, Britain's finance minister. He now controlled the empire's money. But Churchill, always confident, made a decision many would regret. He returned Britain to the gold standard, a strict economic policy that caused wages to fall and unemployment to rise. It was a mistake. By 1929, the global Great Depression was beginning, and Winston's time in government came to an end. He would not return to power for a full 10 years. And this time, the wilderness felt colder. As Churchill grew older, he watched with growing fear. Far across the sea, in Germany, a strange man with a mustache and a roar in his voice was rising fast. His name was Adolf Hitler. He promised glory. He blamed minorities. He built armies. And in Italy, another dictator, Benito Mussolini, marched through cities, preaching fascism. Churchill, unlike many British leaders, saw through the charm and the speeches. He saw the danger, and he began to warn the world. Speech after speech, article after article, he called for rearmament. He said Britain must rebuild its air force. He begged Parliament to wake up. But no one listened. In the 1930s, the world wanted peace at any price. After the horror of World War I, people feared more bloodshed. So when Hitler marched into the Rhineland, Britain did nothing. When Mussolini attacked Ethiopia, Britain said little. When Germany armed itself, Britain stayed quiet. And when Winston Churchill rose to speak in the House of Commons, they laughed. They rolled their eyes. Some even walked out. He was called a warmonger, a relic, a man of the past. And so, Churchill returned to Chartwell. He fed his fish, painted in the garden, wrote late into the night. But he watched, and he waited, because in his heart he knew his time would come again. You might not think of Winston Churchill as a painter, but during these years he picked up a brush and began to create soft landscapes, still lakes, orange skies over French villages. It calmed his restless mind. His home, Chartwell, filled with color. He also became deeply devoted to his family. His wife, Clementine, stood by him through every storm. Together, they raised 5 children. Though Winston was often away in his mind reading, writing, worrying, he still found moments to laugh with them, teach them, and love them. By 1936, Hitler had become Germany's dictator. He had built tanks, warplanes, and concentration camps. He tore up peace treaties. He began to dream of conquest. And again, Winston warned the world. He gave speeches, not angry ones, but stern and honest. He said, "Germany is arming fast. We are asleep. But if we wait too long, we will wake up in chains." Still, the British government chose to appease Hitler to give in, hoping it would avoid war. In 1938, Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain flew to Germany. He returned with a signed piece of paper, smiling. "Peace for our time," he said. But Churchill did not smile. He said, "You were given the choice between war and dishonor. You chose dishonor, and you will have war." By 1939, Hitler invaded Czechoslovakia. Britain still waited. But in September, Germany invaded Poland, and now, finally, Britain could wait no more. World War II had begun. Winston Churchill was called back to government-appointed First Lord of the Admiralty once again, after 25 long years. The Navy received a short message. Winston is back. He was older. He was slower. But his mind burned brighter than ever. And just 8 months later, after failures in Norway and the fall of France, the British people and their king turned to the one man who had never stopped warning them. On May 出皮齐齐, Winston Churchill became Prime Minister. It had been nearly 20 years since he was last in power. He had been mocked, dismissed, forgotten. But now, in Britain's darkest hour, when bombs rained from the sky and Hitler's army marched across Europe, the people turned to the voice that never gave up. Winston Churchill stepped into number 10 Downing Street, and history changed forever. Germany had invaded France, Belgium, and the Netherlands. Nazi tanks rolled like thunder through Europe. And that very night, as bombs fell and governments crumbled, Winston Churchill became Prime Minister. He was 65, old for a war leader, tired in body, but not in spirit. He wrote in his diary that night, "I felt as if I were walking with destiny." The next morning, he gathered his war cabinet. No time to rest. The enemy was coming. 3 days later, Winston Churchill stood before Parliament. His voice was calm, slow, but each word burned. "I have nothing to offer but blood, toil, tears, and sweat." It wasn't comfort. It wasn't sweetness. It was truth. And the British people, they listened. Because in Churchill, they heard someone who wasn't pretending. He told them the road would be hard. But he would never surrender. Just weeks into his leadership, Britain faced disaster. Thousands of British soldiers were trapped on the beaches of Dunkirk, France, surrounded by Nazi forces. Defeat seemed certain. But Churchill gave the order, "Bring them home." And what followed was one of the most emotional rescues in history. Fishermen, ferry drivers, sailboat owners, ordinary citizens crossed the stormy channel in their tiny boats. They saved over 330 men. Churchill called it a miracle of deliverance. But he warned, wars are not won by evacuations. The real fight still lay ahead. Summer 1940. Hitler's next step, invade Britain. But first, he had to destroy its air force. So the German Luftwaffe unleashed wave after wave of bombing raids. Air raid sirens screamed. Children hid in basements. Homes turned to rubble. And above, in the skies, British pilots fought back. They were few in number, young, exhausted, afraid but brave. And Churchill honored them with words that shook the world. Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few. The Royal Air Force held. Britain did not fall. Angry at his failure, Hitler began the Blitz months of nighttime bombing over London. City after city went up in flames. Families slept in subway tunnels. Firemen battled infernos. Churchill walked the ruined streets, never flinching. He refused to hide in bunkers. He wanted people to see him, to believe. "We shall go on to the end," he told them. "We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall never surrender." And they didn't. Even as glass shattered and buildings fell, the people sang in the dark, calling America. Churchill knew one truth: Britain could not win alone. So he looked west to America. He sent messages, made speeches, shared every secret. And finally, he formed a friendship that would help save the world with Franklin D. Roosevelt, President of the United States. They were different in many ways, but both loved freedom. Both hated tyranny. Both believed in courage. Roosevelt sent guns, food, planes, and hope under the Lend-Lease Act. And Churchill, in return, gave something even greater: inspiration. Churchill's voice reached across oceans. On radio, over crackling airwaves, he spoke to Americans. "Give us the tools, and we will finish the job." He did not beg. He invited the free world to stand tall. His speeches were not loud, not fancy, but they were unforgettable. He spoke slowly, powerfully, like a grandfather by the fire, telling truths that no one dared speak. By 1942, Churchill helped form the Grand Alliance: Britain, America, and the Soviet Union. They were strange allies, but they had a common enemy: Nazi Germany. Churchill traveled the world from Egypt to Russia to Washington, meeting generals, planning invasions, shaping a future. He was no longer just Britain's leader. He was the voice of freedom itself. He helped plan the invasion of North Africa, the landings in Italy, and the ultimate battle day in France. And through it all, he never stopped writing, painting, or inspiring his people. Churchill didn't just fight with bombs. He fought with words. Even in the worst moments, he found sentences that gave people hope. If you're going through hell, keep going. Success is not final. Failure is not fatal. It is the courage to continue that counts. This was their finest hour. People wrote these lines on walls, spoke them to their children, carried them like armor in their hearts. On June 6, 1944, the Allies landed on the beaches of Normandy, France. It was the largest invasion in human history. And Churchill, now 70, wanted to go with them onto the battlefield. His generals begged him not to. The king even wrote him a letter: "If you go, I will go too." So Churchill stayed behind. But he waited all night. And when he heard the landing had succeeded, he wept. He knew the war was turning. Freedom was winning. In May 1945, Nazi Germany surrendered. The war in Europe was over. London exploded with joy. People danced in the streets. Church bells rang. Winston Churchill stood before the crowds, his V sign raised high, cigar in hand. He was a hero, a lion. He had led Britain through its darkest night into dawn. But in his heart, he was tired. The world had changed. And now, peace would bring new challenges. Just weeks after victory, Britain held an election. Churchill believed people would want him to stay. But they didn't. They voted for change, for healing, for a new voice. Churchill was shocked. He left office in tears. He had saved his country. And now, they turned away. But true to form, he smiled and said, "That's democracy." And now, as you lie still, perhaps you hear the echo of those words: on the beaches, in the skies, never surrender. The world was saved because one man refused to give up. Our lion has roared. And next time, we'll walk with him into his final years, into reflection, memory, and the soft light of farewell. It was 1945. The guns had fallen silent. The bombs stopped falling. Europe was free. Winston Churchill, the man who had led Britain through fire, was no longer prime minister. He had been voted out. A hero, gently set aside. And so he left Downing Street quietly. Without anger. He went to the country. To Chartwell, his red brick home in Kent. There, surrounded by books, roses, and his beloved black swans, he painted. He wrote, he rested. And for the first time in years, he heard silence. Churchill loved to paint. He began during moments of depression what he called his black dog. But now, in these golden years, painting gave him peace. He stood in fields, brush in hand, capturing skies, rivers, flowers. He once said, "Painting is a companion with whom one may walk a great part of life's journey." And indeed, he painted over 500 canvases. For a man who had spoken so many powerful words. This was now his quiet language. Even in retirement, Churchill couldn't sit still. He began writing his 6-volume memoirs. The Second World War. It was not just history, it was his memory, his thoughts, his truth, and the world read every word. The books made him millions, but more importantly, they made him a global voice once again. And in 1953, he won the Nobel Prize in Literature, not for peace, not for war, but for words. The man who had stirred nations now stirred minds. In 1951, at age 77, Churchill was elected prime minister again. Older, slower, but still burning with purpose. The Cold War had begun a silent, icy standoff between the West and the Soviet Union. Churchill warned of the Iron Curtain falling across Europe. He didn't want another war. He wanted unity between Britain, America, and Europe. But age was catching him. His speeches grew softer, his walks shorter. In 1955, he finally stepped down for good. The lion laid down his crown. Churchill's wife Clementine had been by his side for over 50 years. Strong, private, loyal. She had held the home when he held the nation. They had 5 children, though one died very young. His relationship with them was often distant, especially with his only son, Randolph, who struggled with his father's giant shadow. But Winston loved them all, deeply, even if quietly. In his final years, he spent time with his grandchildren telling stories, drawing them sketches, and giving them small lessons of history, hope, and humor. Even after retirement, Churchill remained the most famous man alive. Kings visited him. Presidents called him. Children wrote letters from every corner of the globe. Statues rose in his honor. Schools, ships, even whole cities bore his name. In America, President John F. Kennedy made him the first honorary U.S. citizen in history. Imagine that. A British Prime Minister, now part of America too. Churchill smiled and said, "I am a child of both worlds." And perhaps he truly was. By the early 1960s, Churchill's health declined. He suffered multiple strokes. He no longer painted. He rarely spoke in Parliament. But he still wore his hat, still smoked his cigar, still walked, slowly, into his study and remembered. He read old speeches, watched old war films, and in his quiet, he smiled. He had lived long. He had fought hard. He had seen the world change and helped shape it. On January 24, 1965, exactly 70 years after his father's death, Winston Churchill passed away. He was 90 years old. Britain mourned as it had never mourned before. His body lay in state in Westminster Hall, the first commoner to receive that honor since the Duke of Wellington. Over 300 people filed past in silence. The Queen herself led the nation in tribute. His funeral was held at St. Paul's Cathedral. Leaders from over 100 nations attended: kings, presidents, soldiers, poets. And as his coffin floated down the River Thames, cranes dipped in salute. The river wept. Churchill was buried in the quiet churchyard of St. Martin's Church, Bladon, near his beloved Blenheim Palace where his story had begun. No giant tomb, no towering monument, just a simple grave. And these words: Winston Leonard Spencer Churchill, 1874, 1965. He rests beside Clementine, his love. And every year, strangers still come. They leave cigars, roses, letters. Because, though he is gone, he is not forgotten. Churchill didn't build mosques or castles like the Mughal emperors. But he built something greater. He built the resistance to tyranny. He built the bridge between nations. He built the language of courage. His legacy is in books that inspire, words that echo, freedoms that live on. And the places he loved, Blenheim, Chartwell, Parliament, still whisper his name. In Britain, he is often voted the greatest Briton of all time. In America, statues honor him in Washington, D.C. Movies have been made, books still written, children still taught his speeches. Some disagree with him; he was not perfect. But even critics agree. He stood firm when it mattered most. He gave hope when hope was gone. He was Winston Churchill. And now, as you close your eyes, think of the man walking slowly through his rose garden, the war behind him, the world at peace, a glass in hand, a memory in his eyes. He lived, he roared. And now, he rests. Good night, dear listener. Sleep well, as the lion sleeps too.